Daniel Williams stood in the doorway of his apartment, his hand trembling against the frame as he watched his best friend Timothy Flores pace across the living room like a caged animal. The words Timothy had just spoken hung in the air between them, electric and terrifying and impossibly beautiful all at once. "I'm scared, Daniel, but I'm more scared of losing you." The confession had torn through Daniel's chest like lightning, illuminating every dark corner where he'd hidden his feelings for the past 3 years. 3 years of watching Timothy date women, of listening to him complain about relationships that never quite felt right, of being the supportive best friend while his own heart slowly broke into smaller and smaller pieces. And now Timothy stood there, his dark eyes wide with vulnerability, waiting for Daniel to say something, anything, to fill the silence that stretched between them like an ocean. Daniel's mind raced backward, trying to understand how they'd arrived at this moment. How had they crossed the invisible line that had kept them safely in the realm of friendship for so long? When had the careful balance they'd maintained finally tipped over into something neither of them could take back? But to understand how they'd reached this precipice, how Timothy had gone from his straight best friend to the man standing before him now, raw and exposed and beautiful in his fear, Daniel had to go back to where it all began to change. Back to 3 months ago, when everything had started to shift beneath their feet like sand. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. It had been a Tuesday night in October when Timothy had shown up at Daniel's door, soaked from the rain and looking like his world had just collapsed. Daniel had been grading papers at his kitchen table when the desperate knocking had pulled him from his work. He'd opened the door to find Timothy standing there, his usually perfect hair plastered to his forehead, his shirt clinging to his chest, his eyes red-rimmed and lost. "Can I come in?" Timothy had asked, and Daniel had stepped aside without question, the way he always did for Timothy. Timothy had dripped water onto Daniel's hardwood floors as he'd stood there, looking smaller somehow than his 6-foot frame should have allowed. "She broke up with me," Timothy had said, and Daniel's heart had done that familiar dance it always did when Timothy's relationships ended. A terrible mixture of sympathy for his friend's pain and shameful relief that another obstacle had been removed from between them. Daniel had made coffee and listened as Timothy had talked about Christina Torres, the woman he'd been dating for 6 months. She'd been beautiful and successful and everything Timothy thought he wanted, but something had been missing. "There's always something missing," Timothy had said, staring into his coffee cup like it held the answers to the universe. "I don't know what's wrong with me, Daniel. I meet these amazing women and I should be happy, but I just feel like I'm playing a part in someone else's life." The words had hit Daniel like a physical blow because he knew exactly what Timothy meant. He'd felt the same way during his own brief attempts at dating women in high school, before he'd finally accepted the truth about himself. But Timothy wasn't like him. Timothy had never shown any interest in men, had never given Daniel any reason to hope for anything beyond friendship. That night, Timothy had fallen asleep on Daniel's couch, and Daniel had covered him with a blanket, his fingers brushing against Timothy's shoulder for just a moment longer than necessary. He'd stood there in the dark, watching Timothy sleep, memorizing the peaceful expression on his face. Daniel had been in love with Timothy Flores for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that he was counting. The next morning, Timothy had woken up with bedhead and apologetic eyes, thanking Daniel for listening and for the couch and for being the best friend anyone could ask for. And Daniel had smiled and made breakfast and pretended that his heart wasn't breaking just a little bit more, the way it always did when Timothy reminded him of the boundaries between them. But something had been different after that night. Timothy had started spending more time at Daniel's apartment, showing up with takeout or bottles of wine, settling into Daniel's space like he belonged there. He'd started asking questions that made Daniel's pulse quicken, questions about love and connection and what it meant to really know someone. "Do you think it's possible to love someone and not realize it?" Timothy had asked one evening in November, his feet propped up on Daniel's coffee table, a glass of red wine in his hand. They'd been watching a movie, some romantic comedy that Timothy had picked, though Daniel had been more focused on the warmth of Timothy's thigh pressed against his own on the small couch. "What do you mean?" Daniel had replied, though his heart had started beating faster at the question. Timothy had been quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "I mean, like, what if you've been looking for something your whole life, and it's been right there the entire time, but you just couldn't see it because you were looking in the wrong direction?" Daniel had felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He'd turned to look at Timothy, studying his profile in the flickering light from the television. Timothy had been staring at the screen, but Daniel could tell he wasn't really watching the movie. "I think," Daniel had said carefully, "that sometimes we get so caught up in what we think we're supposed to want that we miss what we actually need." Timothy had nodded slowly, and then he'd done something that had made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. He'd reached over and taken Daniel's hand, threading their fingers together like it was the most natural thing in the world. Daniel had stared down at their joined hands, his heart hammering against his ribs, wondering if Timothy could feel his pulse racing through his palm. They'd sat like that for the rest of the movie, hands linked, neither of them speaking. When the credits had rolled, Timothy had squeezed Daniel's hand once before letting go, and Daniel had felt the loss of contact like a physical ache. The touches had started after that. Small things at first, so subtle that Daniel had wondered if he was imagining them. Timothy's hand on his shoulder when he laughed at Daniel's jokes. Their knees bumping under the table at restaurants and staying pressed together. Timothy absently playing with Daniel's fingers while they talked. Daniel had cataloged every touch, every moment of contact, storing them away like precious treasures. He'd replayed them later, alone in his bed, wondering if they meant anything or if he was just projecting his own desperate hopes onto innocent gestures of friendship. Then had come the night in December when everything had shifted again. Timothy had arrived at Daniel's apartment with Chinese takeout and a bottle of whiskey, his eyes bright with something Daniel couldn't identify. He'd seemed restless, energetic in a way that had made Daniel's skin prickle with awareness. They'd eaten dinner and shared the whiskey, and Timothy had grown more talkative with each sip. "I've been thinking about what you said," Timothy had announced suddenly, setting his glass down on the coffee table. "About looking in the wrong direction." Daniel had felt his stomach drop. "What about it?" Timothy had turned to face him fully on the couch, his eyes intense and searching. "I think I've been doing that my whole life. Looking in the wrong direction, I mean. I think I've been so focused on what I thought I was supposed to want that I never stopped to ask myself what I actually wanted." The words had hung between them, heavy with implication, and Daniel had felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. "What do you want, Timothy?" Timothy's gaze had dropped to Daniel's mouth, lingering there for a heartbeat that had felt like an eternity. When he'd looked back up, his eyes had been dark and uncertain and beautiful. "I think I want to kiss you," he'd whispered, and Daniel's world had tilted on its axis. The kiss had been soft at first, tentative, Timothy's lips barely brushing against Daniel's like he was afraid Daniel might disappear. But when Daniel had responded, when he'd brought his hands up to cup Timothy's face and kissed him back with 3 years of pent-up longing, Timothy had made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss. They'd kissed until they were both breathless, until Daniel's lips were swollen and Timothy's hair was messed from Daniel's fingers running through it. When they'd finally broken apart, they'd stayed close, foreheads pressed together, sharing the same air. "Oh God," Timothy had whispered, his voice shaky. "Oh God, Daniel, what are we doing?" "I don't know," Daniel had replied honestly, his hands still framing Timothy's face. "But it feels right." Timothy had closed his eyes, leaning into Daniel's touch. "It does," he'd agreed. "It feels more right than anything has in years. But I'm scared, Daniel. I don't know what this means. I don't know what I am." Daniel's heart had ached for the confusion in Timothy's voice. "You don't have to know anything right now," he'd said gently. "We can figure it out together." But Timothy had pulled back then, putting distance between them on the couch. "I should go," Timothy had said. "I need to think about this. I need to understand what's happening to me." He'd left that night, and Daniel had spent the next 3 days in agony, wondering if he'd pushed too hard, if he'd ruined everything by kissing Timothy back. Timothy hadn't answered his texts or calls, and Daniel had been convinced that he'd lost his best friend along with any chance of something more. But Timothy had come back, showing up at Daniel's door on a Friday night with apologies and explanations. "I'm sorry," Timothy had said. "I'm sorry I ran. I just needed time to process everything." Daniel had let him in, had listened as Timothy had talked about his confusion, his fear, his growing realization that maybe he wasn't as straight as he'd always believed. "I keep thinking about you," Timothy had confessed. "About kissing you. About how it felt more real than anything I've ever experienced with anyone else." They'd talked until dawn that night, sitting on Daniel's couch with their legs tangled together, Timothy's head on Daniel's shoulder. Timothy had asked questions about Daniel's own journey, about when he'd known he was gay, about how he'd found the courage to accept it. "I've been in love with you for 3 years," Daniel had finally admitted as the sun had started to rise outside his windows. "I know you're figuring things out, and I don't want to pressure you, but I need you to know. I need you to know that this isn't just physical for me. I love you, Timothy. I love your mind and your heart and the way you make me laugh. I love all of you." Timothy had been quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on Daniel's chest. Then he'd lifted his head and looked at Daniel with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "I think I love you too," he'd whispered. "I think I've been in love with you for longer than I realized. I think that's why nothing ever worked with anyone else." The kiss they'd shared then had been different from the first one, deeper and more certain, filled with the weight of their confessions. Daniel had felt like he was flying, like all the pieces of his life were finally clicking into place. But loving Timothy hadn't made things simple. If anything, it had made them more complicated. Timothy had needed time to come to terms with his sexuality, to understand what it meant for his identity and his future. He'd been terrified of coming out to his family, his co-workers, his other friends. He'd worried about what people would think, about how his life would change. Daniel had been patient, had supported Timothy through every moment of doubt and fear. They'd taken things slowly, had spent weeks just kissing and holding each other, learning how to be together in this new way. Daniel had watched Timothy blossom as he'd accepted this part of himself. But there had been setbacks too. Moments when Timothy's fear had overwhelmed him, when he'd pulled back and questioned everything. Times when Daniel had wondered if Timothy would ever be ready to fully commit to what they had. The worst had been 2 weeks ago, when Timothy's ex-girlfriend Christina Torres had reached out, wanting to reconcile. She'd called Timothy, had told him she'd made a mistake, that she wanted to try again. And Timothy had been tempted. Daniel had seen it in his eyes, the pull of the familiar, the appeal of a life that wouldn't require explanations or coming-out conversations. They'd fought about it, their first real fight since they'd started whatever this was between them. Daniel had accused Timothy of being a coward, of running away from his feelings because they were inconvenient. Timothy had accused Daniel of not understanding the pressure he was under. "You don't get it," Timothy had shouted, his face flushed with anger and frustration. "You figured out you were gay when you were 16. You've had years to get comfortable with it. I'm 32 years old, and I'm just now realizing that everything I thought I knew about myself was wrong. Do you have any idea how terrifying that is?" Daniel had wanted to argue, but he'd seen the genuine panic in Timothy's eyes, the way his hands had been shaking, and his anger had melted into sympathy. "I'm sorry," Daniel had said, reaching for Timothy's hand. "You're right. I don't fully understand what you're going through. But I'm here, Timothy. Whatever you decide, whatever you need, I'm here." Timothy had broken down then, had collapsed into Daniel's arms and sobbed against his chest. "I don't want to go back to her," he'd whispered. "I don't want to go back to pretending. But I'm so scared, Daniel. I'm scared of losing my family. I'm scared of people looking at me differently. I'm scared of not being brave enough to live this life." Daniel had held him, had stroked his hair, and whispered reassurances until Timothy's tears had stopped. They'd talked through the night, had worked through Timothy's fears one by one, had made plans for how to move forward together. Timothy had called Christina the next day and told her definitively that he couldn't get back together with her, that he was with someone else now. He'd started coming out to select friends and family members, had begun the slow process of living authentically. But Daniel could still see the fear in Timothy's eyes sometimes, could still sense the part of him that wondered if he was making the right choice. It was that fear that had led them to tonight, to the conversation that had started with Timothy asking Daniel if he ever regretted falling in love with him. "Do you ever wish you'd fallen for someone easier?" Timothy had asked, sitting on Daniel's couch with a beer in his hands, his eyes fixed on the label he was peeling with nervous fingers. "Someone who wouldn't make your life so complicated." Daniel had set down his own beer and turned to face Timothy fully. "Never," he'd said firmly. "Not once, not ever. You're not a complication, Timothy. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." But Timothy had shaken his head, his expression pained. "I've made everything so hard for you. All the back and forth, all the uncertainty. You deserve someone who knows what they want, who can give you everything without hesitation." The words had hit Daniel like a punch to the gut, because he'd recognized them for what they were. A prelude to goodbye. A setup for Timothy to convince himself that he was doing Daniel a favor by walking away. "Timothy," Daniel had said, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "What are you really saying?" Timothy had finally looked up from his beer, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm saying that I love you too much to keep putting you through this. I'm saying that maybe you'd be better off without me." The words had hung in the air between them, and Daniel had felt something break inside his chest. He'd stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and staring out at the street below, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You don't get to make that decision for me," Daniel had said, his voice tight with emotion. "You don't get to decide what's best for me or what I can handle. I'm a grown man, Timothy. I chose you. I choose you every day, with all the complications and uncertainty and fear. I choose you because I love you, not despite who you are, but because of who you are." He'd turned back to face Timothy, who had been watching him with wide, startled eyes. "You think you're protecting me, but you're not. You're just scared, and you're looking for an excuse to run. Again, that's not fair," Timothy had protested, but his voice had lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Daniel had challenged. "Every time things get real, every time we take a step forward, you find a reason to pull back. First it was Christina, then it was your family. Now it's some misguided idea that you're not good enough for me. When does it end, Timothy? When do you stop running and start fighting for what we have?" Timothy had been quiet for a long moment, his beer forgotten in his hands. When he'd finally spoken, his voice had been barely above a whisper. "I'm terrified, Daniel. I'm terrified that I'm not brave enough to be the man you deserve. I'm terrified that I'll disappoint you, that I'll let you down when things get hard." Daniel had felt his anger drain away, replaced by a tenderness so fierce it had taken his breath away. He'd crossed the room and knelt in front of Timothy, taking the beer from his hands and setting it aside before cupping Timothy's face in his palms. "You already are the man I deserve," Daniel had said softly. "You're kind and funny and brilliant. You make me laugh until my sides hurt. You remember every story I tell you about my students. You're learning to be brave, Timothy. Every day, you're getting braver." Timothy's eyes had filled with tears, and one had spilled over, tracking down his cheek. Daniel had brushed it away with his thumb. "I'm scared too," Daniel had continued. "I'm scared that you'll decide this is too hard and walk away. I'm scared that I'll lose not just the man I love, but my best friend too. But I'd rather be scared with you than safe without you." Timothy had closed his eyes, leaning into Daniel's touch. "I don't want to lose you either," he'd whispered. "I can't imagine my life without you in it. But what if I'm not strong enough for this? What if I can't handle the pressure? Then we'll figure it out together," Daniel had said. "We'll take it one day at a time, one challenge at a time. But we'll do it together, Timothy. You don't have to be strong enough for both of us. You just have to be strong enough to stay." Timothy had opened his eyes then, and Daniel had seen something shift in his expression. A decision being made, a line being crossed. "I want to stay," Timothy had said. "I want to fight for this. For us." And that's when Timothy had stood up, had pulled Daniel to his feet and into his arms. That's when he'd said the words that had brought them to this moment, standing in Daniel's doorway with the weight of their love and fear and hope hanging in the air between them. "I'm scared, Daniel," Timothy had said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm scared of what this means, scared of how my life is going to change, scared of not being good enough for you. But I'm more scared of losing you." I'm more scared of going back to a life where you're just my friend, where I have to pretend that you don't own my heart completely. And now here they were, Daniel's hand still trembling against the doorframe. Timothy still pacing across the living room like he was trying to walk off the energy of his confession. The silence stretched between them, filled with 3 years of unspoken longing and 3 months of careful exploration and this moment of absolute truth. Daniel pushed off from the doorframe and stepped into the room, closing the distance between them. Timothy stopped pacing, turning to face him with eyes that were wide and vulnerable and so beautiful that Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. "Timothy," Daniel said, his voice soft but steady. "Come here." Timothy crossed the room in 3 quick strides, stopping just close enough that Daniel could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other, the air between them electric with possibility. "I love you," Daniel said, the words falling from his lips like a prayer. "I love you for being scared and staying anyway. I love you for being brave enough to fight for us. I love you for choosing me, for choosing this, even when it's terrifying." Timothy's eyes filled with tears, and he reached out to touch Daniel's face, his fingers gentle against Daniel's cheek. "I love you too," he whispered. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes. But not as much as the thought of losing you." Daniel leaned into Timothy's touch, turning his head to press a kiss to Timothy's palm. "We're not going to lose each other," he said. "We're going to figure this out together, remember? One day at a time." Timothy nodded, his thumb brushing across Daniel's cheekbone. "One day at a time," he repeated. "Starting with today." Daniel smiled, feeling something warm and bright unfurl in his chest. "Starting with right now?" he corrected, and then he leaned forward and kissed Timothy, soft and sweet and full of promise. The kiss deepened naturally, Timothy's arms coming up to wrap around Daniel's waist, pulling him closer. Daniel lost himself in the familiar taste of Timothy's mouth, in the way Timothy's body felt pressed against his own, solid and warm and real. This was what he'd dreamed of for 3 years, this sense of completeness, of being exactly where he belonged. When they finally broke apart, they stayed close, foreheads pressed together, sharing the same air. Daniel could feel Timothy's heart beating against his chest, rapid but steady. "So what happens now?" Timothy asked, his voice soft and wondering. "Now we go to bed," Daniel said, smiling at the way Timothy's eyes widened. "To sleep," he clarified, laughing at Timothy's expression. "We go to bed and we hold each other, and we wake up tomorrow, and we figure out the next step." Timothy's smile was radiant, transforming his face with joy and relief. "That sounds perfect," he said. They moved through Daniel's apartment together, turning off lights and locking doors with the easy familiarity of people who had been in each other's spaces for years. But there was something different now, an intimacy to their movements that hadn't been there before. When Timothy brushed past Daniel in the hallway, his hand lingered on Daniel's hip. When Daniel reached around Timothy to turn off the kitchen light, Timothy leaned back into the contact. In the bedroom, they undressed with careful consideration for each other's boundaries, changing into sleep clothes with a sweet shyness that made Daniel's heart ache with tenderness. Timothy borrowed one of Daniel's t-shirts, and seeing him in Daniel's clothes made something possessive and protective flare in Daniel's chest. They settled into bed together, Timothy curling against Daniel's side like he'd been doing it for years instead of months. Daniel wrapped his arms around Timothy, holding him close, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. "Daniel," Timothy said softly, his voice muffled against Daniel's chest. "Yeah, thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for not giving up on me when I was too scared to know what I wanted." Daniel pressed a kiss to the top of Timothy's head. "Thank you for being brave enough to want me back," he replied. "Thank you for staying." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, Daniel's fingers combing gently through Timothy's hair, Timothy's hand resting over Daniel's heart. Daniel could feel the tension leaving Timothy's body gradually, the way it always did when they held each other like this. "I keep thinking about the first time you told me you loved me," Timothy said suddenly, his voice soft and wondering. "Do you remember what you said?" Daniel smiled in the darkness. "I said I loved your mind and your heart and the way you make me laugh." Timothy lifted his head to look at Daniel, his eyes serious in the dim light. You said you loved how I always remember to bring you coffee when you know you've had a bad day. Daniel nodded, his thumb brushing across Timothy's cheekbone. I did say that. I started doing that because I was in love with you, Timothy confessed. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, I can see it so clearly. I was always looking for excuses to take care of you, to make you smile. I was in love with you long before I understood what that meant. Daniel felt his throat tighten with emotion. How long? He asked softly. Timothy was quiet for a moment, thinking. Remember when I got food poisoning last spring, and you took care of me for 3 days? Daniel remembered. Timothy had been miserable, barely able to keep anything down, and Daniel had canceled his weekend plans to stay with him, bringing him soup and ginger ale and sitting with him while he slept. You didn't leave, Timothy continued. You didn't have to stay, but you did. You slept on my couch, and you made sure I was okay every few hours. And when I finally started feeling better, you were so relieved that you actually cried. I remember thinking that no one had ever cared about me like that before. I remember thinking that if love felt like anything, it probably felt like that. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. That was 8 months ago. Timothy nodded. 8 months of being in love with you and not understanding what it was. 8 months of feeling like something was missing from every other relationship because none of them were you. They kissed then, soft and slow and sweet, tasting like promises and new beginnings. When they broke apart, Timothy settled back against Daniel's chest, his breathing already evening out toward sleep. I'm still scared, Timothy murmured, his voice drowsy and content. Me too, Daniel replied, his arms tightening around Timothy. But we'll be scared together. Together, Timothy agreed, and Daniel could hear the smile in his voice. Daniel lay awake for a while after Timothy's breathing had deepened into sleep, marveling at the weight of Timothy's body against his own, at the reality of having the man he loved safe in his arms. He thought about everything they'd been through to get to this point, all the fear and uncertainty and moments of doubt. He thought about the conversation they'd had earlier, about Timothy's confession and his own response, about the way they'd finally stopped running from what they felt for each other. There would be challenges ahead, Daniel knew. Timothy would still have moments of fear and doubt. There would be difficult conversations with family and friends, navigating a world that wasn't always accepting, learning how to be a couple instead of just friends who were in love with each other. But they would face it all together, and that made everything else seem manageable. Daniel pressed another kiss to Timothy's hair, breathing in his scent, committing this moment to memory. The first night of the rest of their lives, the first time they'd fallen asleep together as a real couple, no longer hiding from what they felt for each other. I love you, Daniel whispered into the darkness, and even though Timothy was asleep, Daniel could have sworn he felt him smile against his chest. 3 weeks later, Daniel woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon, sunlight streaming through the windows of what had become their shared bedroom. Timothy had officially moved in the week before, his clothes mingling with Daniel's in the closet, his books filling the empty spaces on Daniel's shelves. Daniel found Timothy in the kitchen, humming softly to himself as he flipped bacon in the pan, wearing nothing but boxer shorts and one of Daniel's old college t-shirts. The sight made Daniel's heart do that familiar flip it always did when he looked at Timothy. But now there was no accompanying ache of longing, no sharp edge of wanting what he couldn't have. Now there was just love, pure and simple and returned. Morning, Daniel said, wrapping his arms around Timothy from behind, pressing a kiss to the side of his neck. Timothy leaned back against him, tilting his head to give Daniel better access. Morning, beautiful. Sleep well. Better than I have in years, Daniel replied honestly. Every night was better now. Every morning a gift. They'd settled into a rhythm over the past 3 weeks, learning how to be together in all the small, domestic ways that Daniel had dreamed about for so long. Timothy made coffee in the mornings while Daniel showered. Daniel cooked dinner while Timothy graded papers at the kitchen table. Timothy had come out to his parents the week before, a conversation that had been difficult but ultimately loving. His mother had cried, but she'd also hugged Timothy and told him she just wanted him to be happy. His father had been quiet at first, processing, but he'd eventually asked to meet Daniel properly, as Timothy's boyfriend instead of just his friend. The word still made Timothy smile every time he said it. Boyfriend, partner, the man I love. He'd started using the terms more freely, testing them out like new clothes, getting comfortable with the shape of them in his mouth. Daniel's phone buzzed on the counter, and he reached for it with one arm still wrapped around Timothy's waist. It was a text from his sister Amy Lee, a photo of her and her girlfriend at brunch with the message, "When do we get to meet the famous Timothy officially?" Daniel showed Timothy the text, and Timothy grinned. "This weekend," he said, "if you want. I'm ready to meet your family as your boyfriend." The word still sent a thrill through Daniel every time he heard it. "Are you sure?" he asked. "No pressure." Timothy turned in Daniel's arms, his hands coming up to frame Daniel's face. "I'm sure," he said. "I'm ready to stop hiding. I'm ready to live this life with you, all of it. The easy parts and the hard parts and everything in between." Daniel kissed him then, tasting coffee and morning and the promise of all their tomorrows. When they broke apart, Timothy was smiling that radiant smile that never failed to make Daniel's knees weak. "I love you," Daniel said, the words as natural as breathing now. "I love you too," Timothy replied. "More than I ever thought possible." They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other in the golden morning light, and Daniel marveled at how far they'd come. From friends to lovers, from fear to courage, from hiding to living openly and honestly. It hadn't been easy, and Daniel knew there would still be challenges ahead, but they would face them together. The bacon was starting to burn, but neither of them moved to turn off the stove. They were too busy kissing, too caught up in the simple joy of being able to touch each other freely, to love each other without reservation or fear. Finally, Timothy laughed against Daniel's mouth and pulled back. "The bacon," he said, reaching over to turn off the burner. "Let it burn," Daniel said, pulling Timothy back into his arms. "I have everything I need right here." Timothy's smile was soft and wondering, like he still couldn't quite believe this was real. "Sometimes I can't believe this is my life now," he said, echoing Daniel's thoughts. "Sometimes I wake up and I'm surprised all over again that I get to have this. That I get to have you." Daniel understood exactly what he meant. After 3 years of longing, of watching Timothy from the sidelines, of loving him in secret, sometimes it felt surreal to be able to hold him like this, to kiss him whenever he wanted, to fall asleep next to him every night, and wake up in his arms every morning. "You have me," Daniel said softly. "For as long as you want me, you have me. Forever then," Timothy replied without hesitation. "I want you forever." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with promise and possibility. Forever was a long time. But looking at Timothy now, seeing the love and certainty in his eyes, Daniel could believe in it, could believe in them. They ate breakfast together at the kitchen table, their knees touching under the small surface, talking about their plans for the day. Timothy had papers to grade. Daniel had a faculty meeting, but they would meet for lunch if their schedules allowed. These small domestic negotiations, these ordinary moments of planning and coordinating, felt precious to Daniel. After breakfast, they got ready for work together, sharing the bathroom mirror, Timothy stealing kisses while Daniel brushed his teeth. Daniel watched Timothy knot his tie in the reflection, still amazed that this beautiful, complicated, brave man was his. At the door, Timothy paused, his hand on the knob. "Daniel," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "Yeah, thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself." Daniel stepped closer, straightening Timothy's tie unnecessarily. "Thank you for being brave enough to let me love you," he replied. "Thank you for choosing us." Timothy kissed him goodbye, soft and lingering, and Daniel watched from the window as Timothy walked to his car, turning back to wave before he drove away. Such a simple thing, watching your boyfriend leave for work, but it filled Daniel with a contentment he'd never experienced before. That evening, they met for dinner at their favorite restaurant, the little Italian place where they'd had their first official date 3 weeks ago. The hostess knew them now, seated them at their usual table by the window, and Daniel marveled at how quickly they'd built these small traditions, these markers of their relationship. Over pasta and wine, Timothy told Daniel about his day, about the student who'd finally understood a concept he'd been struggling with, about the colleague who'd complimented his new haircut. Daniel shared his own stories, about the faculty meeting that had run long, about the email he'd received from a former student. These conversations were different now than they'd been when they were just friends. There was an intimacy to them, a sense of sharing not just the events of their days, but their inner lives, their thoughts and feelings and reactions. Timothy no longer held back parts of himself, no longer filtered his words through the careful boundaries of friendship. "I was thinking," Timothy said over dessert, his fingers playing with Daniel's across the small table. "Maybe we should take a trip together. Somewhere we've never been. Somewhere we can just be ourselves without worrying about running into people we know." Daniel's heart skipped. "Where did you have in mind?" "I don't know. Somewhere with beaches maybe. Somewhere warm where we can walk on the sand and hold hands and not think about anything except each other." Daniel could picture it perfectly. Timothy in swim shorts and sunglasses, his skin golden from the sun. Long walks on the beach, dinners by the ocean, falling asleep to the sound of waves. It sounded like paradise. "I'd like that," Daniel said. "I'd like that a lot." Timothy smiled, bringing Daniel's hand to his lips and pressing a kiss to his knuckles. "Good. I'll start looking at flights tomorrow." They walked home hand in hand, taking the long way through the park, in no hurry to end the evening. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, but Daniel felt warm all over, heated from within by happiness and love and the simple pleasure of Timothy's fingers laced with his own. At home, they settled on the couch together, Timothy's head in Daniel's lap, while Daniel graded papers and Timothy read a book. It was comfortable and domestic, and everything Daniel had ever wanted. Timothy would occasionally read him a funny passage from his book, and Daniel would share amusing mistakes from his students' essays. Later, in bed, they made love slowly and sweetly, taking their time with each other, mapping the familiar territory of each other's bodies with hands and mouths, and whispered endearments. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Timothy's head on Daniel's chest, Daniel's fingers combing through Timothy's hair. "Daniel," Timothy said softly, his voice drowsy with satisfaction. Do you ever think about the future? About what we'll be like in 5 years, 10 years?" Daniel smiled in the darkness. "All the time," he admitted. "What do you think about?" Timothy was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing idle patterns on Daniel's chest. "I think about us having a house together. Something with a big kitchen where you can cook and a yard where we can have barbecues with our friends. I think about traveling together, seeing the world. I think about growing old with you, about being one of those couples who've been together so long they finish each other's sentences." Daniel's throat tightened with emotion. "That sounds perfect," he said softly. "I think about marrying you," Timothy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someday, when we're ready. I think about standing in front of our friends and family and promising to love you for the rest of my life." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The word marriage hung in the air between them, precious and fragile and full of possibility. They'd never talked about it before, never put words to the future they both saw stretching out ahead of them. But hearing Timothy say it made it real in a way that took Daniel's breath away. "I think about that too," Daniel admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I think about calling you my husband. I think about wearing your ring and you wearing mine, and everyone knowing that we belong to each other." Timothy lifted his head to look at Daniel, his eyes bright even in the dim light. "Really?" he asked, and Daniel could hear the vulnerability in his voice, the need for reassurance that this dream they were building together was solid and real. "Really," Daniel confirmed, cupping Timothy's face in his hands. "I want all of it with you, Timothy. The house and the travels and the growing old together. I want to marry you and build a life with you and love you until the day I die." Timothy's eyes filled with tears, and he leaned down to kiss Daniel, soft and deep and full of promise. "I love you," he whispered against Daniel's mouth. "I love you so much." "I love you too," Daniel replied. "Always." They held each other in the darkness, talking softly about their dreams and plans, about the life they wanted to build together. Timothy talked about the kind of wedding he'd want, small and intimate with just their closest friends and family. Daniel talked about the honeymoon they'd take, somewhere tropical and beautiful where they could celebrate being married. It was all hypothetical still, dreams and wishes and someday maybes, but it felt real to Daniel in a way that nothing ever had before. He could see it all so clearly, their future together, and it was beautiful and bright, and everything he'd ever hoped for. Eventually, Timothy's breathing evened out into sleep, but Daniel lay awake for a while longer, marveling at the conversation they'd just had. 6 months ago, Timothy had been dating women and Daniel had been nursing a hopeless crush. Now they were talking about marriage, about spending their lives together, about growing old side by side. Life had a funny way of surprising you, Daniel thought. Sometimes the thing you wanted most was closer than you realized, waiting just around the corner, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Daniel pressed a kiss to Timothy's forehead and closed his eyes, letting himself drift towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, new moments to treasure and new memories to make. But tonight, he was exactly where he wanted to be, holding the man he loved in his arms, dreaming of all their tomorrows. 6 months later, Daniel stood in their new house, watching Timothy hang pictures in the living room. They'd bought the place together just last month, a small craftsman with a big kitchen and a yard where they could have barbecues with friends. Moving in together officially, combining their belongings and creating a space that was truly theirs, had felt like another beginning. Timothy had proposed 3 weeks ago, on a Saturday morning in their kitchen. Nothing fancy or elaborate, just Timothy getting down on one knee while Daniel was making pancakes, his voice shaking with emotion as he'd asked Daniel to marry him. Daniel Williams, Timothy had said, the ring box trembling in his hands, you are my best friend, my partner, my home. You've loved me through my fears and doubts, and helped me become the man I was meant to be. Will you marry me? Daniel had said yes before Timothy had even finished the question, had pulled him to his feet, and kissed him with all the love in his heart. The pancakes had burned on the stove, but neither of them had cared. They'd been too busy crying and laughing and marveling at the rings on their fingers. Now, as Daniel watched Timothy adjust a photo of them at the beach, he marveled at how far they'd come. From friends to lovers to partners to fiancés. Each step a choice they'd made together. Each moment building toward this beautiful life they'd created. Morning, handsome, Timothy said, turning to smile at Daniel over his shoulder. Daniel crossed the room and wrapped his arms around Timothy from behind. How did I get so lucky? He murmured against Timothy's ear. Timothy leaned back against him, solid and warm and real. We both got lucky, he said softly. We found each other. And Daniel knew it was true. Against all odds, despite fear and confusion and the long years of loving in secret, they'd found their way to each other. They'd been brave enough to risk everything for love, and love had rewarded them with more happiness than either of them had ever dreamed possible. The wedding was still 4 months away, but they were already deep in planning mode. Timothy had thrown himself into the details with characteristic enthusiasm, researching venues and caterers with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life. Daniel had been content to let Timothy take the lead on most decisions, happy to watch his fiancée's excitement as they toured reception halls and tasted wedding cakes. But he'd insisted on being involved in writing their vows, had spent weeks crafting the words that would express everything Timothy meant to him. Last night, they'd finalized the guest list, a mix of family and close friends who had supported them through their journey. Daniel's sister Amy Lee would be his best woman, and Timothy had asked his college roommate to be his best man. It would be small and intimate, exactly what they both wanted. You're thinking about something serious, Timothy observed, settling beside Daniel on their new couch. Just thinking about how much I love our life, Daniel replied, accepting the cup of coffee Timothy offered him. How much I love you. Timothy's expression softened, and he leaned over to kiss Daniel gently. I love our life too, he said. I love you too. More every day somehow. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning light stream through their windows, surrounded by the boxes they were still unpacking. Outside, their neighbors were starting their day, and Daniel felt a deep sense of belonging, of being exactly where he was supposed to be. Do you ever think about that night? Timothy asked suddenly, his voice soft and thoughtful. The night I told you I was scared. Daniel knew exactly which night he meant. The night that had changed everything between them. The night Timothy had finally stopped running from his feelings and chosen love over fear. All the time, Daniel admitted. It was the bravest thing you'd ever done. Timothy lifted his head to look at Daniel, his eyes serious and grateful. It was the smartest thing I'd ever done, he corrected. Choosing you, choosing us, was the best decision of my life. Daniel set down his coffee and pulled Timothy closer, holding him tight against his chest. I'm so proud of you, he said softly, for how far you've come, for the man you've become, for having the courage to be yourself. Timothy's eyes filled with tears, and he buried his face against Daniel's neck. I couldn't have done it without you, he whispered. You made me brave. We made each other brave, Daniel corrected, pressing a kiss to Timothy's temple. We saved each other. And it was true, Daniel realized. Timothy had saved him just as much as he'd saved Timothy, had rescued him from a life of loving from the sidelines, of accepting less than he deserved, of believing that his dreams were impossible. Together, they'd created something beautiful and lasting, a love that had grown stronger through every challenge they'd faced. They'd learned to trust each other completely, to be vulnerable and honest and real in ways that Daniel had never thought possible. Outside, the world was waking up to another day, but inside their home, Daniel and Timothy were exactly where they belonged. Together, always together, building a life filled with love and laughter and all the small, precious moments that made up a shared existence. Timothy had fallen asleep against Daniel's chest, his breathing slow and even, his face peaceful and relaxed. Daniel held him carefully, not wanting to wake him, content to sit here in the morning light and hold the man he loved more than life itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, new moments to treasure and new memories to make. But today, they were home together, safe in each other's arms, surrounded by the love they'd fought for and won. Daniel closed his eyes and let himself drift, thinking about all the tomorrows stretching out ahead of them. A lifetime of mornings and evenings, of ordinary days and special occasions, of growing old together and loving each other through it all. He thought about the scared man who had stood in his doorway almost 2 years ago, trembling with fear and love and desperate hope. That man had been brave enough to choose love over safety, to risk everything for the chance at happiness. And Daniel would be grateful to him forever, because that moment of courage had given them both the life they'd always dreamed of. Sometimes the most frightening dares led to the most beautiful discoveries, Daniel thought as he held his sleeping fiancée close. Sometimes the thing you wanted most was closer than you realized, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, love won in the end. Daniel pressed one more kiss to Timothy's hair and settled back into the couch cushions, his fiancée safe in his arms, their future bright and beautiful stretching out ahead of them like a promise. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that they were both exactly where they needed to be. Outside, the wind continued to blow, but inside their home, Daniel and Timothy were exactly where they belonged. Together, always together, building a life filled with love and laughter and all the small, precious moments that made up a shared existence.